If your 11-month-old suddenly started eating less, that's probably the most normal thing they've done all week. I know that sounds backwards, especially when you're sitting there with a full plate of carefully prepared food, watching your baby push it around like they're conducting a science experiment instead of eating lunch. But here's what's actually happening, and why pediatricians see this pattern so consistently, they'd be more surprised if it didn't happen. Your baby isn't being difficult or picky or going through some concerning regression. Their body is doing exactly what it's supposed to do at this stage. And understanding why comes down to something most parenting books bury in footnote-sized print somewhere around chapter 12. From birth to 6 months, your baby was in the fastest growth phase of their entire life. They were essentially a tiny human growing machine, and that required an enormous amount of calories relative to their size. Then, between 6 and 12 months, that growth rate starts to slow down, which sounds gentle and gradual until you realize we're talking about a significant metabolic shift. And from 12 to 18 months, it slows even more dramatically. Most babies triple their birth weight in the first year, which is this insane biological achievement. But once they hit that mark, the body doesn't need the same fuel intake anymore. It's not a problem. It's actually evidence that growth is proceeding exactly as it should, even though it feels wrong when you're used to them eating everything in sight. When pediatricians talk about this phase, they're very clear about one thing. The baby's appetite is adjusting to meet their current energy needs, not your expectations or the feeding schedule that worked 2 months ago. Your 11-month-old's body is essentially recalibrating its hunger signals based on what it actually requires now, which is legitimately less food than it needed when growth was happening faster. This isn't intuitive for parents because we're wired to see eating as good and not eating as bad, full stop. But babies at this age are incredibly good at self-regulating if we let them. And when they start eating less, they're usually just listening to accurate internal signals that their calorie requirements have genuinely decreased since the 6-month mark. Now layer teething on top of this, which for a lot of babies starts around 6 months but can hit particularly hard right around the 11-month mark when molars start making their appearance. Teething hurts. It makes the entire mouth feel uncomfortable, sometimes swollen, and eating becomes this thing that used to be pleasant, but now involves putting pressure on the exact parts of their mouth that are already bothering them. So babies eat less, not because they're not hungry, but because the act of chewing or even just having food touch their gums is genuinely unpleasant. This is temporary, and it usually cycles with the teething pattern, which means some days are worse than others. And that inconsistency makes parents think something's really wrong, when it's actually just teeth doing their thing. Between 7 and 12 months, babies are going through absolutely massive developmental changes. They're learning to crawl, pull themselves up, maybe cruise along furniture, and their entire world has exploded from whatever's in front of my face to I can get to that thing across the room myself. That's cognitively enormous, and food becomes genuinely less interesting than everything else happening around them. Sitting still in a high chair to eat requires ignoring all the fascinating stuff they could be investigating instead. And for a lot of 11-month-olds, that's just not a trade they're willing to make anymore. This isn't defiance or a feeding problem, it's actually evidence of healthy developmental progression, even though it makes mealtimes feel like you're trying to feed a tiny, distracted escape artist. There's this statistic that gets referenced in pediatric circles, but doesn't make it into most parenting conversations. In 90% of cases, when a baby suddenly eats less, it's just another phase of development, a minor disruption in routine, or simple fatigue. 90%. That means the vast majority of the time, there's nothing medically wrong, nothing you did wrong, nothing that needs intervention beyond just understanding what's happening and giving it time. The remaining 10% usually involves actual illness, like a fever or digestive issue that's causing genuine loss of appetite beyond normal developmental changes. But most parents operate under the assumption that decreased eating probably means something's wrong, when statistically, it almost certainly means everything's fine, and your baby's body is just doing normal 11-month-old things. When pediatricians assess whether decreased eating is concerning, They're not actually looking at how much your baby ate at individual meals, because appetite varies day to day in this age group, sometimes dramatically. What they're watching is whether the baby's active, whether they're gaining weight appropriately over time, even if it's slower than before, and whether they're having enough wet diapers to indicate adequate hydration. Those are the actual markers of whether nutrition is sufficient, not whether they finished their lunch or had a light dinner on Tuesday. A baby who's crawling around, hitting milestones, and staying hydrated, but eating smaller portions than they used to, is, from a medical standpoint, probably doing completely fine. It's the combination of decreased eating plus lethargy, weight loss, or dehydration that signals something beyond normal development. So when should you actually worry versus when should you just ride this out? If your baby's eating less, but they're still engaged, playful, making milestones, and you're seeing those wet diapers throughout the day, you're almost certainly in the normal development category. And this phase will shift again as they continue growing. If they're eating less and also seem lethargic, running a fever, showing signs of digestive problems, or you're noticing actual weight loss or decreased urination, that's when you call the pediatrician, because those combinations suggest illness rather than just developmental appetite adjustment. The answer to the question I planted at the start: pediatricians get more concerned when babies at this age don't show any appetite decrease, because it can sometimes indicate they're not shifting into the normal, slowed growth phase, or, well, it's just statistically unusual given how common this pattern is. If this helped you stress less about your baby's suddenly smaller portions, hit like and subscribe if you want more of these research breakdowns that actually explain what's happening, instead of just saying, trust your instincts and leaving you guessing.